For Creamer Media's Polity, I am Shannon Durehove. I am at the Helen Suzman Foundation in Parktown to meet with political analyst Aubrey Machiki, who is discussing the ANC Policy Conference. At the ANC's recent policy conference in late June, there was a proposal that the ANC begin mobilizing society towards a second transition. What did the second transition proposal entail?
Well, the idea was rejected in the first place because the theoretical foundations of a second transition were questioned. But if we leave aside the fact that the idea of a second transition was rejected, the argument was that the first 2 decades of democracy have been very good on the democratic front, meaning that the democratic experience of citizens at an institutional level and the level of rights has been largely positive. But what has been lacking is consolidating what the ANC would call economic freedom. And therefore the authors of the second transition document argued that what would be needed beyond 2014 is a second transition during which economic freedom would be the key imperative.
Instead of a second transition, the ANC Policy Conference committed the party to mobilizing society towards a second phase of social and economic transformation. Is the difference merely semantics? What is the policy content of the second phase?
I don't think the difference is semantic. It's about the theoretical foundation for policy solutions. And what the conference said is, or asked, is how do you characterize the current phase in our history? And in their view, the current phase in our history does not constitute an independent transition period, but is part of a broader transition from the end of apartheid to the creation of what the ANC calls a national democratic society. That would be the antithesis of apartheid society. And therefore, the shift from a second transition to a second phase emphasizes the fact that, yes, we have certain challenges at the moment, but they don't constitute an independent transition period on their own, but are a phase that is part of a broader transition.
In your column, you seem disappointed that there seems to be no radical shift in policy coming out of the ANC's policy conference. What policy changes would you like to have seen?
Well, I think we need policy changes that genuinely put people at the center, genuinely put the poor, the working class, and the youth at the center. Many of what the ANC proposed, or most of what it proposed, particularly in relation to economic policy, has been tried in the past and has been promised in the past. The very fact that the authors of the second transition document decry the lack of economic freedom shows the extent to which there has been a gap between political achievements and economic achievements. Nothing in what was said by the ANC at the policy conference takes the ANC outside the current policy paradigm. And it seems to me, if fundamental change is going to occur, it must occur outside the current policy paradigm. Now, that paradigm will change because of 2 things, amongst other things. Compromises that those who sit in the market, like business, investors, and others, must make. And secondly, the role of the state. And maybe thirdly, what concessions must be made by labor to give effect to that idea of economic freedom. Unfortunately, at the moment, what I see is a lack of wisdom amongst key players, the state, labor, business, with regard to the concessions that we need to make sure that we alter the economic conditions of our people, particularly the poor and the working class. So for me, there were 2 kinds of resolutions that were taken at the policy conference. Firstly, what I call the non-decision, where you had lots of words, but effectively no decision. And secondly, the compromise decision. And it seems at that level, what the ANC decided to foreground is the imperative of unity and party cohesion at the expense of policy clarity.
Some have argued that the entire policy conference was a charade and what was actually going on was a leadership battle. What is your view on this?
I think there were two things about the conference. There are those who went to the conference genuinely with the aim of positing policy alternatives. But there are those who went there to put forward policy arguments as proxy arguments for their narrow political and leadership preferences. For instance, if you look at the second transition debate, I personally saw three kinds of people at the conference. There are those who went there in support of the idea of a second transition, when in effect what they were supporting is the idea of Zuma being re-elected in Mangaung. So for them, the second transition was a code for a second term for President Jacob Zuma. You had others who went there against the second transition argument, and they too were positing arguments against the second transition as a code for their opposition for the re-election of Jacob Zuma in Mangaung. But there was a third group of people who were there genuinely interested in the policy debate because they want to see change in this country. Now, if we look at the fact that the ANC did not adopt radical policies outside the current policy paradigm, what it does mean is that the ANC is a step or two behind the wishes and aspirations of ordinary citizens, particularly those who are poor. Because I don't think citizens expect the ANC to adopt radical policies anymore. I think what they require now is radical implementation of those policies.
In your latest column, you argue that the ANC will not be in power forever, but you argue that the ANC can continue to influence South Africa's direction even after it loses power. How so?
Well, the argument I'm making is that the ANC is correct to take its policy proposals to society. The ANC intends taking its policy proposals to key constituencies in society, including business, labor, civil society, and others. For me, this is a good thing, because it's not enough that a vision belongs to the ANC. A vision must be owned by society as a whole, so that the day the ANC is kicked out of power, the party that replaces it runs with that vision, but gives it specific policy content.
When do you think this is likely to happen?
Well, I think it's difficult to say when exactly, but I do think that the electoral environment, if the ANC continues failing to deliver, will get increasingly hostile. And the crisis for the ANC is not going to be an electoral loss. In other words, it's not going to be about the ANC losing its majority. Winning by a small majority can be equally destabilizing and debilitating to the party. For instance, take a scenario in which the DA wins both the Western Cape and Gauteng. In such a scenario, the DA effectively will be in charge of the country. So we tend to think of a crisis for the ANC in terms of the ANC losing its majority, when in fact, to have provinces such as the Western Cape and the Gauteng under DA control would constitute an electoral crisis for the ANC.
Well, thank you very much, Aubrey. I'm glad you cleared that up for me.
You're most welcome.